The moment Margaret Carter climbed down from the stagecoach in Dodge City, Kansas, with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a dead man's name on her lips, she understood with absolute clarity that the frontier did not forgive weakness, and she had very little of anything else left to offer. It was the spring of 1874, and the Santa Fe Trail was alive with the kind of desperate human traffic that only a nation still stitching itself back together after war could produce. Families moved westward in creaking wagons loaded with everything they owned. Cattle drives pushed north through the tall grass. Soldiers from nearby Fort Dodge patrolled roads that had a habit of going lawless after dark. And Margaret Carter, 23 years old, alone, and possessed of exactly $11.40, stood on the packed dirt main street of Dodge City and tried very hard not to look like what she was, a woman entirely without protection. She had come from St. Louis, where her mother had died in February of a fever that swept through the tenement district near the river. Her father had died 3 years before that, during the war, at a place called Chickamauga that she could barely pronounce. There had been a cousin in Santa Fe who had written twice and offered the possibility of work, and that possibility, thin and uncertain as it was, had been enough to purchase a stagecoach ticket with the last of her savings and set her face toward the west. The journey from St. Louis to Dodge City had taken 11 days, and those 11 days had taught her things about the world that no one in her mother's parlor had ever mentioned. She had learned, specifically, that a woman traveling alone on a westward route was considered by a certain kind of man to be an invitation. There had been a man on the coach named Arden Prout who had a wide, flat face and a habit of sitting too close, and by the time the coach reached the outskirts of Dodge City, he had made it abundantly clear that he intended to involve himself in her future arrangements, whether she welcomed his involvement or not. She did not welcome it at all. The coach had barely rolled to a stop before Arden Prout was at her elbow, offering to carry her bag, offering to find her a room, offering a string of generosities that were not generous at all, but were instead a net being laid at her feet with the patience of a man who believed the net would close. Margaret had looked around the street in something close to panic, cataloging faces and searching for any reasonable exit from the situation, and that was when she saw the cowboy. He was leaning against the post of the Dodge House Hotel with the particular ease of a man who had nowhere urgent to be, one boot crossed over the other, a hat pulled low enough to shadow most of his face. He was tall, with the kind of lean, rope-hardened build that came from years of actual work rather than the performance of it. His coat was dust-colored and practical. His hands were large and brown from the sun. He was watching the street with quiet, observant eyes the color of weathered timber, and when those eyes drifted to Margaret, and the man pressing too close at her side, something in his expression shifted to a kind of alert stillness. Margaret Carter had never been a woman who acted without thinking. She was methodical, careful, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had taught her that words were tools and tools should be used precisely. But desperation has a way of bypassing caution, and what she did next was entirely instinctive. She looked directly at the cowboy, raised her chin, and called across the gap of street with a voice that was steadier than she had any right to make it. "There you are. I have been looking everywhere for you." The cowboy went very still. Arden Prout turned to look at him. The street continued its ordinary business around them, indifferent. Margaret crossed the distance at a walk that she hoped conveyed certainty and not the terror racing underneath it, and when she reached the cowboy she took his arm with both hands and stepped in close and said, quietly and rapidly, through a smile that was directed at Prout over her shoulder, "Please. Please just go along with whatever I say. I will explain everything later. That man has been a problem for 11 days and I need him to believe I am spoken for." The cowboy looked down at her. His eyes up close were more green than brown, and they moved from her face to Prout and back again with an assessment that was quick and thorough. He said nothing for a moment that lasted just long enough to make her stomach drop. Then he put his own arm around her shoulders, easy and natural as if he had done it 10,000 times, and said, loud enough for Prut to hear, "Sorry, sweetheart. Got held up at the livery. Everything all right?" The word sweetheart, delivered in that unhurried Western drawl, was the single most welcome sound Margaret had heard in 11 days. She leaned into him slightly and said, "Perfectly fine now." And then she looked at Arden Prut and said, with genuine sweetness, "My husband has arrived. I hope you had a pleasant journey." Prut looked at the cowboy. The cowboy looked back at Prut with an expression that communicated nothing threatening and everything necessary, the way a fence communicates to a man on horseback exactly where the property line is. Prut decided, wisely, that his future arrangements did not require Dodge City after all, and he retrieved his bag from the coach and walked away down the street without another word. Margaret exhaled. The cowboy's arm dropped from her shoulders, and he stepped back and looked at her with an expression she could not fully read. "Thank you," she said. "I am very sorry to have involved you. I did not know what else to do." "You all right?" he asked. It was a simple question, and she appreciated that he did not ask it with drama. "I am now," she said. "My name is Margaret Carter. I'm traveling to Santa Fe and I have no husband. I apologize for the deception." The cowboy tilted his head and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. "Clayton Winslow," he said. "And for what it is worth, you looked like you needed a husband about 60 seconds ago, so I do not think the apology is strictly necessary." She looked at him. He looked at her. The spring wind moved dust down the center of the street, and somewhere down the block a horse stood patient at a hitching post, and Margaret Carter felt, for the first time since St. Louis, something loosen in her chest. "I still have to get to Santa Fe," she said. Clayton Winslow pushed back his hat and squinted at the horizon as if calculating something. "So do I," he said. "I am riding a cattle drive down to Cimarron, passes through New Mexico territory." He paused. "There is a wagon company leaving in 3 days. Reverend Howell is leading it, good man, known him for years. They would have room for one more, but, she asked. "He does not take single women," Clayton said. He did not say it unkindly. It was simply a fact about the world, the kind of fact that Margaret was already intimately acquainted with. His policy. He lost a woman on his last crossing who had no one to look after her, and he has not forgiven himself for it. Margaret held her carpetbag in both hands and thought about $11.40 and a cousin in Santa Fe who may or may not still be at the address on the letter. She thought about the road west, which she had heard from 3 different people on the stagecoach was no place for a woman alone. She thought about Arden Prut and the fact that he was still somewhere in this town. Then she looked at Clayton Winslow and said, very carefully, "If a married woman wanted to join that wagon company, would the Reverend have any objection?" Clayton Winslow was quiet for a moment. She watched him think it through, watched him weigh whatever it was a man weighed when a woman he had met 3 minutes ago asked him to continue a charade that had begun as an act of mercy. "No," he said at last slowly. "He would not." "Would you?" she said, and she held his gaze because it was important that she be honest about what she was asking. "Be willing to pose as my husband for the duration of the trail, so that I can travel safely to Santa Fe." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a serious man taking a serious question seriously, and Margaret respected it. "I would want a few things clear," he said. "As would I," she replied. They walked into the shade of the Dodge house porch and sat in 2 plain wooden chairs, and Clayton Winslow said that he did not lie as a practice, and what she was proposing was a lie. And so he wanted her to understand that he was making an exception, and it was not to be taken as evidence of any general carelessness with honesty. She said she understood, and that she agreed completely. He said that the arrangement was purely practical and would end when they reached Santa Fe. She said that was exactly what she intended. He said that if she was in any genuine danger at any point, he expected her to tell him directly and not attempt to manage it alone. She looked at him when he said that, because it was an unexpected thing to say, and she said she would. Then she said that she had no money for a room at the Dodge house and asked if he could recommend somewhere cheaper. He thought about it for a moment, and then he stood up and went inside the hotel and returned 5 minutes later with a key and said the room was paid for and she should not argue about it. She started to argue about it immediately. He held up one hand and said, "We are supposed to be married, Margaret Carter. A man whose wife is sleeping in a ditch would be noticed." She took the key. She also made a mental note to repay him once she reached Santa Fe and found the cousin and secured some form of income, and she was absolutely serious about that note. The 3 days before the wagon company's departure were, in their way, educational. Clayton Winslow, she discovered, was 27 years old and had been working cattle since he was 15. He had grown up in Texas, near Abilene, on a ranch that his father had run until drought and debt had taken it when Clayton was 20. He had been trail riding ever since, honest work but itinerant, following the herds north to the railheads and then drifting back south to begin again. He was not unhappy about this life, but she got the sense when he talked about his father's ranch that there was something in him that missed the idea of a place that belonged to him. She told him about St. Louis and her mother and the cousin in Santa Fe, and he listened the way he did everything else, which was quietly and with full attention. He did not offer unnecessary sympathy or platitudes, which she found she liked considerably more than she would have expected. They met with Reverend Howell on the second day, and Margaret discovered that the Reverend was a broad, kind-faced man in his 60s who shook Clayton's hand with genuine warmth and welcomed her with a formality that was actually quite courteous. There were 8 other families in the wagon company, most of them from Missouri or Kansas, all of them headed for new starts in New Mexico or Colorado. Margaret watched them and understood immediately that these were not people who had left because things were going well. They were people who were leaving because they had run out of other options. She understood that feeling in her bones. On the third morning, the wagons rolled out of Dodge City at first light. The Santa Fe Trail in the spring of 1874 was a thing of brutal and occasional beauty. The tallgrass prairie stretched in every direction like a green-gold ocean, broken only by the distant smudge of the Cimarron River and the wide emptiness of sky. The air smelled of sage and cattle and distance. The wagons moved at the pace of the oxen, slow and steady and relentless, and the days settled into a rhythm that was almost peaceful if you did not think too hard about the distance remaining. Clayton rode alongside the wagon in the mornings and helped with the oxen. He was competent and unhurried with animals in the way of a man who had spent most of his life around them. He spoke to the oxen calmly when they were stubborn and did not shout, which Margaret noticed because one of the other men in the company had a habit of shouting at his team that she found unpleasant. In the afternoons, when the sun was at its worst, Clayton would sometimes ride ahead to check the trail, and she would sit in the wagon with the Reverend's wife, Eliza Howell, who was small and sharp-eyed, and had a laugh that came out of nowhere like a bird startled from tall grass. Eliza Howell was not fooled. Margaret knew it from the second day, when Eliza said, with her back turned and her hands busy folding a blanket, "Your husband does not sit close to you when you eat." Margaret had paused for only a moment. "He has always been a man who needs his space," she said carefully. Eliza had turned then and looked at her with the measured calm of a woman who had heard every variety of story on every variety of trail and had made her peace with the human capacity for complicated circumstance. "He is a good man, Clayton Winslow," she said. "I have known him for 3 years. He has helped my husband twice in situations where he had no obligation to." Margaret said nothing. She met Eliza's gaze steadily. Eliza said, "Whatever arrangement you two have made, it is your business and not mine. But I will say this to you because I am old enough to have learned it and I like you. A woman alone on this trail is not safe. Whatever reasons brought you to the arrangement you are in, they were not unreasonable reasons." "No," said Margaret quietly. "They were not." Eliza nodded, And that was the end of the conversation, and also somehow the beginning of something warmer and more honest between them. And Margaret found herself telling Eliza more than she had told anyone in a long time. Not everything, but more. On the fifth day, they crossed into what the men called rough country, where the trail pushed south toward the Cimarron cutoff, and the hills began to show their bones through the grass. The wagon ahead of them lost a wheel at noon, and the company stopped while the men worked to repair it. Clayton was among those who helped, and Margaret stood in the shade of the wagon and watched him work alongside two other men she had come to know slightly. A big quiet farmer named Eli Tanner and a younger man named Samuel Park, who had come west from Ohio and was still adjusting to the reality of it. She watched Clayton Winslow with an honesty that she allowed herself precisely because he was not looking at her. He worked with an economy of movement that was pleasant to observe, never wasted, never showy, just a man who knew exactly what his body needed to do and did it. He was not the kind of handsome that announces itself. He was the kind that accumulates, detail by detail, until one day you notice that you have been looking at someone more often than you meant to. She stopped this train of thought very firmly and went to help Eliza with the cooking fire. That evening, around the fire after supper, Reverend Howell led a brief prayer for safe passage, and then the company sat and talked in the way that people do when they are alone in a large darkness together. Stories came out the way smoke does, slow and various and belonging to the fire. Eli Tanner talked about his farm in Missouri and the flood that had taken it. Samuel Park talked about his mother and made no attempt to hide the fact that he missed her tremendously, which Margaret respected. One of the other women, a heavy-set red-haired woman named Dorothea Vance, told a story about meeting her husband that had everyone laughing. Clayton, when it came around to him, talked about a cattle drive up from Texas 2 years before, about a night on the Kishom Trail when a lightning storm had spooked the herd, and every man on the drive had ridden for 4 hours straight in the rain, just trying to keep 2,500 head from running themselves into the Arkansas River. He told it without flourish, but there was something in the telling that was vivid and alive, and when he finished, there was a little silence around the fire that was the silence of people who have been put briefly inside a different experience. Margaret caught herself looking at him again. He was talking to Eli Tanner now, something quiet about grazing land, and the firelight moved across his face, and she looked away at the dark prairie and had a brief, firm conversation with herself about practicality and reality and the temporary nature of all arrangements. She lost the conversation with herself entirely on the 9th day. The 9th day began unremarkably enough, with a cool gray morning and the slow business of loading the wagons. But by mid-afternoon the sky to the south had gone the color of a bruise, and Reverend Howell, who had made this crossing 4 times, looked at it for a long moment and said to Clayton, "How far to the ravine cutoff?" Clayton studied the sky. 4 miles, he said, maybe 5. We will not make it, said Howell. No, said Clayton, we will not. What followed was an hour of the most concentrated, organized effort Margaret had yet seen from the company. The wagons were circled and tied. The animals were secured. Everything that could blow away was packed down or stowed. The canvas covers were lashed with extra rope. Children were put inside the wagons and told to stay there. The wind started to come before the rain did, a sound like a freight train a long way off that kept getting closer, and then the sky opened. Margaret was inside the wagon when Clayton came up over the wheel and dropped down beside her, soaked through already, his hat in his hand. The wagon lurched and shuddered in the wind. The canvas snapped and strained. Outside, the world had become a horizontal gray curtain of rain, and the thunder was rolling through in continuous waves. They sat side by side in the shuddering wagon, braced against the goods around them, and did not speak for a while because there was no point in speaking over the noise. At one point, a particularly violent gust hit, and the wagon tilted at an angle that made Margaret grab instinctively for the nearest solid thing, which happened to be Clayton's arm. He put his hand over hers and held it there, He did not let go when the gust passed, and she did not take her hand back. "Have you been in one of these before?" she asked when the thunder had rolled a little further east and speech was possible again. "Several," he said. "The wagon will hold." "I am not frightened," she said. He looked at her sideways. "I know," he said. "You are not frightened of much as far as I can tell." She did not know what to say to that. It was the most personal thing he had said to her in 9 days, and it landed somewhere inside her chest in a way that she did not have an immediate category for. "I am frightened of some things," she said, because she was honest by nature. "What things?" he asked. The storm was still loud but not roaring now, settling into a steady rain, and the wagon had stopped its worst shuddering. "I am frightened," she said carefully, "of arriving somewhere and finding that the thing I traveled to find is not there." He was quiet for a moment. His hand was still over hers. "The cousin," he said. "Yes. And if she is not there?" Margaret had thought about this a great deal, late at night in the dark of the wagon with the prairie sounds around her. "Then I will find something else," she said. "I am capable of work. I can teach. I can sew. I am not without skills." "No," he said quietly. "You are not." And something in the way he said it was not simply an agreement with her statement, but something that felt like seeing, like being looked at by someone who was actually paying attention to what was there. And Margaret found that her ability to maintain any sort of defensive distance from this man was eroding at a rate that alarmed her slightly. She did not take her hand away from under his for the rest of the storm. The rain passed by evening, and the company emerged from the wagons into a world that smelled of wet earth and lightning and renewal. And the sky in the west, where the last of the day was going, was a color that had no name for it, orange and violet and something else entirely, laid out over the prairie like a painting that God had left to dry. Margaret stood outside the wagon and watched it and felt Clayton come to stand beside her, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and she thought that this was perhaps the most comfortable she had ever felt in the presence of another person, which was an extraordinary thought to have about a man she had known for 12 days. "Clayton," she said. "Yes," he said. "When we reach Santa Fe," she said, because she had to say it, because she had to be a woman who said the difficult true things rather than left them unspoken. "We will part ways. That is what we agreed." He was quiet. "I need you to know that I understand that," she said, "and that the arrangement has been everything you said it would be, and I am genuinely grateful." He turned to look at her. The violet was leaving the sky and the stars were coming out, big and unrestricted in the way that prairie stars always were. "You are telling me that," he said, "as though you think I might have forgotten." "I am telling you that," she said, "because I am not entirely certain I have not forgotten." The silence that followed that sentence was different from any silence that had come before it. It was the silence of something named aloud for the first time, and both of them stood in it and let it be what it was. Clayton said, "Margaret." She looked at him. He said, "I do not make a practice of pretending. I have said that to you already. But I have found these past 12 days that this particular pretending has been harder and harder to call pretending." She exhaled slowly. "That is a very careful way of saying something," she said. "I am a careful man," he said, "with most things." "What things are you not careful with?" He reached out and tucked a strand of her dark hair back from her face, and his fingers were rough from rope and work and weather, and the touch was impossibly gentle. "Apparently," he said, "with women who commandeer strangers on street corners and call them their husbands without a moment's hesitation." She laughed. It came out of her unexpectedly, genuine and warm, and she pressed her hand over her mouth and then took it away because there was no reason to hide a laugh. "That was a moment of extraordinary desperation," she said. "It was a moment of extraordinary nerve," he said, and he was smiling now, and the smile changed his face completely, opened it up, made him younger and less guarded and considerably more dangerous to her composure. She said, "I do not know what I am saying exactly. We are strangers." "We are strangers who have shared a storm," he said, "and a fire and 11 days of trail and a great deal of conversation." "And a fictional marriage," she said. "That too," he said. They stood there in the cooling evening, and neither of them moved toward the other or away, and the night settled around them like something patient. And eventually, Eliza Howell called from across the circled wagons that supper was ready, and they went back to the fire and sat with the others and ate, and the evening was ordinary and unremarkable, and nothing was resolved, and Margaret lay in the wagon that night unable to sleep for quite some time. The trail continued south and west through the Cimarron country, and the land changed as they went, the tall grass giving way to shorter varieties, and the horizon taking on the shimmering quality of the desert approaches. They passed through what some of the men called no man's land, the strip of territory between Kansas and Texas that belonged officially to no state and was therefore governed, as Clayton described it flatly, by whoever was biggest and least thoughtful on any given day. They pushed through it at a good pace and came out the other side with no worse trouble than a broken axle on Eli Tanner's wagon. On the 17th day they crossed into New Mexico territory, and something shifted in the air, or perhaps only in Margaret's chest, which amounted to the same thing. The land here was different. Red rock formations rose from the earth in columns and shelves that looked deliberate, as if the land was demonstrating something. The sage grew thick and purple-scented. The sky seemed larger here, somehow wider, as if New Mexico had more sky to offer than Kansas did. Clayton rode beside the wagon in the late afternoon and pointed to a flat-topped mesa in the distance and told her it was called Capulin, and that there was a volcano inside it, long extinct but present, and she stared at it with the interest of a woman who had grown up surrounded by buildings and had not yet exhausted her capacity to be astonished by the shape of the earth. "What made you come west?" she asked him. "Not for the cattle drive. I mean, what kept you coming west year after year instead of settling somewhere east?" He thought about the question with the seriousness he gave most things. "Something in me that is still looking," he said, "for a thing I will know when I find it." "What kind of thing?" "A place," he said, "that feels like mine, that I have built with my own hands and can sit on the porch of and know that it is what I made it." She thought about that for a while as the wagon rocked and creaked along the rutted trail. "I think that is a beautiful thing to want," she said. "What do you want?" he asked. "When you find the cousin. After that, I mean." "I have not let myself want anything after," she said honestly. "The after has felt too uncertain to want things in. But if you could," he said, "if the cousin is there and everything is settled and you have a moment to want." She looked at the mesa. She thought about the fire and the storm and the stars. She thought about a hand over hers in the shuddering dark. "Something that is also mine," she said. "Something I have built. Something with roots deep enough that a drought cannot take it." He looked at her then, steadily, from horseback, with the mesa behind him and the afternoon light going gold across everything, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and the look between them said a great deal. On the 21st day, something happened that changed things in a way that could not be unchanged. Margaret was walking alongside the wagon in the late morning, which she often did to rest the oxen and stretch her own legs, when Samuel Park came running back from the front of the company at a pace that brought everyone to a halt. His face was the particular white of genuine alarm. "Men on the ridge," he said, pulling up to Reverend Howell's wagon. "4 of them. Just sitting up there watching." Howell and Clayton and Eli Tanner rode up to look, and the rest of the company pulled in tighter. Margaret stood by the wagon and watched the ridge, and after a moment could see them herself, 4 riders against the skyline, too far to read clearly but unmistakably present and unmistakably watching. Clayton came back at a walk that was deliberately unhurried, designed, she understood, to keep the mood of the company steady. He dropped down from his horse beside her. "Likely just road agents checking to see what kind of company we are," he said quietly. "If they see we are organized and armed, they will move on. And if they do not," she said. "Howell's company is well armed," he said. "We have 8 men who can shoot, and we have been in this kind of situation before. I do not want you to be afraid." "I told you I am not frightened of much," she said. "You also told me you were frightened of some things," he said. I want to know you are not alone in this." She looked up at him. There were times when what he said was so simply and directly kind that it moved through her with the force of something much larger. "I know that," she said. "I know I am not alone." He put his hand briefly on her arm and then went back to help with the company's defensive arrangement, and the riders on the ridge watched for another half-hour and then were gone as quietly as they had appeared, and the company moved on, and that was the end of it. But what stayed with Margaret was not the threat, which had come to nothing. What stayed was that moment, his hand on her arm and the absolute certainty in his voice when he said she was not alone. It was a complicated thing, to realize that you had been alone for a very long time, and that you had adapted to it so thoroughly that you had ceased to notice it until its absence made itself known. On the 23rd night, the company camped by a creek that Clayton said fed eventually into the Canadian River, and it was cold enough that everyone built their fires bigger than usual and sat close around them. Dorothea Vance produced a fiddle from somewhere in her wagon and played 3 songs that were not sad and then 2 that were, and people sang along with the ones they knew, which were most of them, and the sound went up into the desert sky, and the coyotes in the distance answered it, and the night was simultaneously lonely and very full. When the fire burned low and people drifted to their wagons, Margaret sat for a few minutes more, watching the coals. Clayton sat beside her. They were close, closer than they usually sat, because the cold had compressed everyone around the fire and because honestly, she reflected, the distance between them had been shrinking for days in a way that had nothing to do with weather. "Clayton," she said. "Margaret," he said. "When did you know?" she said, then stopped. "Know what?" he asked, though she thought he might already know what she meant. "That this was not pretending," she said. "For you, when did you know?" He looked at the coals for a moment. "The storm," he said. "When you were not afraid, or when you said you were afraid but not of the storm, of arriving somewhere and finding the thing you traveled for was not there. I thought about that for a long time afterward." He paused. "And the night of the prairie stars when you told me you had not forgot." She nodded slowly. "I should not have said that," she said. "Why not?" he asked. "Because it complicated a simple arrangement." "Margaret," he said, and turned to look at her directly. "This stopped being a simple arrangement on approximately day 4, and I believe you know that as well as I do." She held his gaze. "I do know that," she admitted. The fire popped and sent a small shower of sparks into the cold air between them. Clayton reached out and took her hand, not as he had done in the wagon during the storm, not covering it as protection or reassurance, but deliberately, fingers laced through hers, a different thing entirely. She felt the warmth of it go all the way up her arm. "I have never done anything in my life without thinking it through," he said. "I am not the kind of man who runs at things. I am the kind of man who circles them 3 times to make sure he has seen all the angles." "I have noticed that," she said softly. "I have circled this," he said, "approximately 900 times in 23 days, and every single angle looks the same." She waited. "I do not want to reach Santa Fe and leave," he said. "I want to tell you that plainly because you are a woman who deserves plainness. I do not know what that means yet or how it would work or whether you want the same, but I wanted you to know." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at their joined hands in the ember light. Then she said, "I came west with $11.40 and a dead man's name and no plan beyond finding a cousin who might not be there. I am not in a position to plan the rest of my life tonight." "I am not asking you to," he said. "But," she said, and felt the words sit there, solid and honest, "I do not want to leave either. When we reach Santa Fe, I do not want to part ways and forget that any of this happened." He squeezed her hand. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of moment that does not require any elaboration to be complete. They sat by the dying fire for another hour, talking about small things, his horse, a gray named Patience who was exactly what the name implied, her mother's garden in St. Louis, the way the stars moved differently over different kinds of ground. They talked like people who are no longer performing anything for anyone, who have arrived at the particular ease of genuine familiarity. And when the cold finally drove them to the wagon, they climbed in, and Margaret slept better than she had since Missouri. The last week of the trail was hard in the way that all final stretches are hard, when the destination is close enough to want but far enough to exhaust. The terrain was rougher now, the roads less well kept, and they passed through small settlements that were part trading post, part saloon, part general store and everything else. At one of them, a place called Rayado that sat in a green valley beneath the Cimarron Range, the company stopped for supplies and rest, and Margaret went with Eliza Howell into the small general store and bought a length of pale blue calico cloth, because she needed a new dress, and because it was the color of the New Mexico sky, and because she had enough money for it after Clayton had quietly returned the $11 she had spent on nothing, tucked into her carpet bag without comment, which she had argued about for an entire morning before giving up. In the Rayado General Store, while Eliza was bargaining for flour, Margaret noticed on the wall behind the counter a yellowed handbill advertising land grants in New Mexico territory. The government was offering homestead rights to settlers willing to build and work. She read it twice and then asked the storekeeper about it. He was a small, dark-haired man named Vicent who had been in the territory since before it was a territory, and he explained the process with the precision of someone who had answered the question many times. You filed a claim, you built on it, you worked it for 5 years, and it was yours. She thought about that for the rest of the day. That evening she told Clayton about the handbill. He listened with his full attention, which was the way he always listened, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. You are thinking about staying, he said. I am thinking about what there is to stay for, she said. If the cousin is there, I will have work. If she is not, I will need to make something from nothing anyway. And making something from nothing on your own land is better than making nothing on someone else's. He had that look on his face that she had come to recognize as the 3 circles around it expression. There is land east of Santa Fe, he said, along the Pecos, good water, good grass. I know a man who filed there 2 years ago and his cattle operation is sound. She understood that he was saying more than the words, and she said carefully, Are you saying that as information or as something else? He said, As something else. She said, Then say the something else. He looked at her steadily. This careful man who had come to her aid on a street corner in Dodge City and ridden with her across 400 miles of the American West, and held her hand in a storm and by a fire, and had been, in every way that mattered, the best kind of husband a woman could have asked for even when he was not her husband at all. He said, I have been thinking about land along the Pecos for 2 years. I have been thinking about something that is mine, that I have built. And I have been thinking for about the last 23 days that the piece missing from that picture was not cattle or water or grass. She held very still. I would like, he said, carefully and with total sincerity, to ask you, Margaret Carter, when we reach Santa Fe, if you would be willing to consider staying, not because you have no other option, not out of gratitude or convenience, but because I believe we have built something real on this trail, and I would like the chance to build something more real still, if you want that. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about her mother, who had loved her father with a completeness that had left nothing over, who had said once, when Margaret was 17, that the best thing a person could do was find someone whose silences they could live in without discomfort. She thought about the silences she had shared with Clayton Winslow, in the storm and by the fire and on the long rolling miles of the trail, and how not one of them had ever felt like a gap. Yes, she said. And then, because she wanted to be clear, not conditionally, not as a consideration, yes. The expression that crossed his face then was the one she would remember for the rest of her life. Not the smile, which came after, but the thing before the smile, the unguarded flash of something that had been held in check for 23 days and was now allowed to simply be what it was. Santa Fe came into view on the 29th day, its flat adobe buildings the color of the earth they rose from, spread across the high desert in a pattern that had been there, someone told Samuel Park, for longer than the United States had existed. The The Rio Grande glinted silver in the late afternoon to the west. The air smelled of pine from the mountains above the city and something cooking below, and the particular quality of high-altitude air that was thinner and cleaner than anything Margaret had breathed since before St. Louis. Reverend Howell led the company through the gates of the old plaza, and people came out to look at them as they always looked at wagon companies coming in from the trail, with the mixture of recognition and sympathy that belongs to people who have made the crossing themselves and know what it costs. Children ran alongside the wagons. A dog barked. A man selling dried chilies from a cart shouted something in Spanish that made Vicent of the Rayado General Store, who had ridden with them the last few miles, laugh. The company dispersed over the following hours, each family to their own prearranged lodging or inquiry, and Reverend Howell shook every hand and embraced his wife, and said a prayer of genuine gratitude that moved several people, including Margaret, who was not by nature sentimental but who had ridden 29 days with these people through storm and no man's land and the spectacular indifference of the American West, and felt something considerable toward all of them. She found her cousin. Her name was Ruth Dalton, née Carter, and she was 31 years old and had been in Santa Fe for 4 years with her husband Thomas, who ran a dry goods store on a street near the plaza that smelled of leather and spice and practical things. Ruth opened the door to her knock and stared for a moment and then burst into tears, which was unexpected but clearly genuine, and pulled Margaret inside and began immediately producing food from directions that seemed barely possible given the small size of the kitchen. Margaret sat at Ruth's table and ate bread and dried fruit and drank coffee that was stronger than anything she had encountered east of Missouri, and she told Ruth about St. Louis and their mother and the journey, and Ruth listened and cried at the right parts and asked sensible questions at the right parts. And by the time the coffee was done, Margaret understood that the cousin was real and present and glad to see her, and that the option of work at the dry goods store was genuinely on offer. Then Ruth asked about Clayton. Margaret had mentioned him in the telling of the journey, and Ruth was a perceptive woman, and she had noticed. Margaret told her about the street corner in Dodge City. Ruth's expression cycled through several interesting stages. Margaret told her about the arrangement. Ruth's expression settled into the particular look of a woman receiving news that she intends to have extensive opinions about later. Margaret told her about the fire and the storm and what had been said on the 29th night of the trail. Ruth said, "Where is he now?" "He is settling the horse and seeing the company off," Margaret said. "He said he would come later." "Later," Ruth said, and nodded in the way of someone filing away a significant detail. He came 2 hours later, knocking at the door with his hat in hand, and Ruth let him in and studied him with an attention that was courteous but comprehensive. And then she did something that Margaret found both deeply human and deeply touching, which was to put more food on the table without being asked. Clayton ate and talked with Ruth and Thomas Dalton with the ease he brought to most social situations, which was not flashy ease but genuine ease, the ease of someone who is interested in other people as a general matter. Thomas asked about the cattle business, and Clayton answered in detail, and Thomas listened with the absorbed attention of a man who finds such things genuinely interesting. Ruth asked about the trail, and Clayton described it accurately but lightly, skimming over the worst of it in the way that Margaret understood was not false, but was considerate of what a woman who had worried about her cousin all these weeks might need to hear. After supper, when Thomas had gone to close up the store and Ruth was in the back of the house, Clayton and Margaret sat on the narrow front step of Ruth's house in the Santa Fe evening, which was cool and purple-shadowed and smelled of wood smoke and high desert flowers. "She approves of you," Margaret said. "How do you know?" he asked. "She fed you twice," Margaret said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been to the land office." She turned to look at him. "Today, while you were with your cousin," he said, "I asked about the Pecos Valley filings. There is a section still available east of the mountains, 8 miles from a town called Anton Chico, Good water, good grass, as I said. You went to the land office today, she said. I am a man who knows what he wants when he has circled it enough times, he said. I have been thinking about land along the Picos for 2 years and thinking about you for 29 days, and I have circled both long enough. She looked at him for a long moment in the Santa Fe dusk. The section is available for joint filing, he said. A man and his wife can file together and the claim holds under both their names. Clayton Winslow, she said. Margaret Carter, he said. You are asking me to marry you, she said. On a front step in Santa Fe, 29 days after we met on a street corner in Dodge City, Kansas. I am asking you, he said, to make real the thing we have been pretending, because I believe it is already real. I believe it became real somewhere around the Cimarron River and never went back to being anything else. She looked at his face in the fading light, this careful, quiet, genuinely good man who had held her hand in a storm and stood between her and trouble without being asked, and listened to her with his whole attention every single time she spoke. She thought about her mother and the things she had said about silences. She thought about the prairie stars and the fire and the feel of riding 29 days across half the American West with someone who had started as a fiction and become, in every way she could measure, more real than almost anything else in her life. Yes, she said. Again. He smiled, and this time there was nothing held back in it at all. They were married by Reverend Howell 11 days later in the small courtyard of a church near the Santa Fe Plaza, with Ruth and Thomas Dalton as witnesses, and Eliza Howell present, who cried with a thoroughness that she herself seemed surprised by. Samuel Park, who had found work at a livery and was becoming steadily less overwhelmed by the West, attended and looked very moved. Dorothea Vance attended and brought the fiddle. The ceremony was brief and honest, and when Reverend Howell, who knew precisely what the history was, said the words about husband and wife, he said them with a warmth that communicated something specific, which was that he had known from approximately day 3 of the crossing that this particular arrangement was not going to stay the kind of arrangement it had started as. Clayton said his vows with the directness of a man who does not waste words and means everyone he uses. Margaret said hers with the clarity of a woman who has made her peace with certainty and chosen it deliberately. And when it was done and he kissed her, there in the courtyard of the old church with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains above the city going pink in the afternoon light, it was the kind of moment that does not require ceremony to make it real, because it was already real before the ceremony began. They spent 3 weeks in Santa Fe while Clayton arranged the cattle operation, sold a portion of his trail riding contract to another hand, and acquired from a rancher on the outskirts of the city 2 breeding pairs of cattle and a team of draft horses for the wagon they purchased, with the combined sum of his savings and the money from the contract. Margaret worked with Ruth at the dry goods store during this time, learning the territory and the trade, and she also acquired seeds, several books that Ruth pressed on her, and a reputation among Ruth's neighbors for being forthright and competent and not easily impressed, all of which she was. In the evenings they sat on Ruth's front step or at her table, and they talked, still with the ease of trail companions but with something added now, something that had no name except perhaps the particular quality of a new marriage that is also a genuine friendship, which is the only kind of marriage worth having. Clayton told her more about Texas and his father's ranch. She told him more about her mother, and about what it had been like to grow up the daughter of a schoolteacher in St. Louis, which was to grow up surrounded by books and by the constant emphasis on the importance of knowing things, and she thought that had suited her, had made her the kind of person who could pick up a carpetbag and cross half a continent because she had read about the West and understood, more or less, what to expect of it. He said once very quietly, watching her read by lamplight at Ruth's table, "You know, when I was standing outside the Dodge house and you came across the street and grabbed my arm, I thought, that is the most genuinely courageous thing I have seen in some time." She had looked up from her book. "It was desperation," she said. Desperation that looks like courage is still courage, he said. And you did it without breaking stride. You did not waver for a second. She thought about that. I was terrified, she said. Of course you were, he said. That is what makes it courageous. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the way he had put his over hers in the wagon during the storm, deliberate this time, and they sat like that in the lamplight while Ruth moved around in the back of the house, and the Santa Fe night settled around them. The journey to their land along the Pecos took 2 days by wagon. Clayton drove and Margaret sat beside him on the wagon seat, which was nothing like a stagecoach seat, and everything like something she had been wanting without quite knowing what to call the wanting. The land opened up east of the Sangre de Cristos in a way that was different from the prairie and different from the desert approaches. More green, more sheltered by the curve of the mountains to the west, crossed by the silver thread of the Pecos River moving south through its cottonwood gallery. When Clayton stopped the wagon at a spot where the river bent and the grass grew thick on a flat above the bank, with a low red ridge to the north providing shelter from winter winds and the sky enormous in every other direction, she knew without being told that this was the place. This is it, she said. This is it, he agreed. They sat on the wagon seat for a moment looking at it. It is a great deal of nothing right now, she said. It is, he said. We have a good deal of work ahead of us, she said. We do, he said. Good, she said, and climbed down from the wagon and went to look at the river bank. What followed was the kind of work that is not romantic in the moment but becomes romantic in the memory, the physical act of building something from ground up with another person who matches your effort and does not complain about the parts that are genuinely hard. They camped first while the foundation of the house went in, Clayton doing the heaviest work and Margaret doing everything else, which was most of it. A neighbor from the town of Antonchico, a Mexican rancher named Gregorio Sandoval who had been in the Pecos Valley for 20 years and had opinions about everything from weather patterns to soil quality, rode over on the third day and said something in Spanish and then switched to English and said that they had chosen the best spot on the river and that the soil on the south-facing slope would grow anything. He then helped them for 3 days without being asked, because that was what neighbors did in the Pecos Valley in 1874, and they fed him and he talked while he worked in a way that was genuinely interesting, full of the history of the land and the river and the people who had moved through it over the centuries. He told them about the Comanche raids that had been a feature of the valley's life until very recently, and Margaret listened to that with the seriousness it deserved, understanding that the West was not a blank space waiting for settlers to write upon it, but a place with a long and complicated human history, much of it painful, and that the land they were building on had other people's stories in it. Clayton knew this already and had thought about it. She could tell by the way he listened to Gregorio, and she liked that about him, that he was a man who could hold uncomfortable truths without flinching or dismissing them. There were also Apache people who traveled through the territory, and Gregorio described the particular protocols of encounter that had kept the peace in his corner of the valley for the past several years, based primarily on mutual respect, and the understanding that the land was genuinely large enough to be many things to many people if human stupidity could be prevented from deciding otherwise. Margaret filed all of this away with the thoroughness of her father's daughter and resolved to conduct herself accordingly. The house went up in 2 months, with help from Gregorio and from a carpenter who came from Antonchico for a week. It was not large, but it was solid, adobe in the local style, because adobe was what made sense in this climate, and the Sandovals knew how to build it, with thick walls that kept the summer heat out and held winter warmth in, and a porch on the south side where the afternoon sun came in clean and long. On the day they moved their things from the wagon into the house, which was October, and the cottonwoods along the river were going yellow, Clayton stood in the center of the main room with his hat in his hand and looked at the walls around him and then at her, and she saw on his face the expression she had been watching for, the one she had heard about when he had talked about his father's ranch. That quality of a man looking at something that belongs to him, not by conquest, but by the labor of his hands. And she went to stand beside him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in the house they had built, and the afternoon light came through the window and lay across the earthen floor in a long gold rectangle. "It is ours," he said. "It is ours," she said. The first winter on the Pecos was hard in the way that first winters are, requiring adjustments that no amount of preparation entirely accounts for. The river flooded in November after a heavy rain in the mountains, and they spent 2 days sandbagging the lower pasture to protect the cattle. The temperature dropped in January to a cold that was different from Missouri cold, drier and colder at night, and they went through firewood faster than anticipated. The cattle needed supplemental feed that required a trip to Anton Chico in conditions that were not ideal. But they also had Gregorio Sandoval, who appeared at crucial moments with practical wisdom and occasionally food. They had the Daltons in Santa Fe, who sent letters, and once in December, a package containing coffee and preserves, and a book that Margaret had mentioned wanting, with a note from Ruth that was warm and newsy, and ended with the information that she was expecting a child in the spring, which made Margaret cry a little bit, and then write a very long letter in return. And they had each other, which turned out to be, Margaret reflected on a January evening watching the fire with Clayton's arm around her, and the wind testing the windows of the adobe house, not a small thing at all, but the kind of foundation that everything else rested on. She was herself expecting a child by February. She told Clayton on a morning when the Pecos was partly frozen, and the cottonwoods were black and white against the snow, and he sat very still for a moment when she told him, and then he stood up and crossed the kitchen and held her against him with a gentleness that was entirely specific to this man who was careful with the things that mattered. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said, "in August, I think." He held her for a long time without speaking, and she felt his heart against her cheek and the warmth of him around her, and thought that she had come west in spring of 1874 with $11.40 and a desperate act on a street corner in Dodge City, and that the path from there to here had been improbable and hard and occasionally frightening, and consistently more interesting than anything she had imagined, and that she would not trade a single day of it. The spring came early and fierce, with wildflowers on the mesa that Gregorio said he had not seen like that in 10 years, and the grass along the Pecos grew thick, and the cattle thrived, and Clayton hired a hand named Pedro Vasquez, 19 years old, from Anton Chico, who was strong and willing, and had a gift for horses that Clayton recognized and respected. Pedro was also deeply devoted to Margaret, whom he treated with a formality that she found touching, always removing his hat when she appeared and answering her questions with careful thoroughness. Ruth's baby arrived in April, a boy named Henry Thomas Dalton, and the letter describing him was so full of Ruth's particular voice that Margaret laughed and wiped her eyes alternately throughout the reading of it. She wrote back that she was likewise expecting, and that Ruth should plan to visit, and Ruth wrote back immediately with dates and the information that Thomas had already begun making inquiries about the journey. The Daltons arrived in July, Thomas driving a hired wagon with Ruth enormous and cheerful beside him, and the two families spent a week at the Winslow place along the Pecos that was one of the warmest weeks Margaret could remember, full of good food and long evenings on the porch, and the kind of conversation that only happens between people who are genuinely glad of each other. Henry Thomas Dalton, 3 months old and possessed of an opinion about most things, was passed from arm to arm and at one point ended up in Clayton's large, careful hands, where he looked small and momentous and fell asleep, and Margaret watched her husband hold the sleeping baby with an expression she knew she would always remember. The Daltons went back to Santa Fe after a week, and in August, 12 days past the date Margaret had estimated, Her labor started on a Thursday morning while Clayton was in the north pasture, and Pedro fetched him at a run that brought him back from the pasture at a gallop that he would later say was the most efficient riding he had ever done in his life. There was a woman in Anton Chico named Senora Lucia Benavides who served as midwife for the valley, and she arrived with Gregorio's wife Alina, and the two of them took over the situation with a calm competence that Margaret found deeply reassuring. Clayton was put outside, which he accepted with the particular expression of a man who understands completely that he is where he is supposed to be and is also finding it challenging. By late afternoon it was done. A boy. Dark-haired and loud, with his father's wide-set eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. They named him James Robert Winslow, after both their fathers, and when Senora Benavides brought him out to Clayton, who had been on the porch for 4 hours, the expression on Clayton's face was the most unguarded she had ever seen on him, which was saying something given how far he had come from the careful reserve of day one in Dodge City. He came in and sat beside her and held James Robert and looked at her over the baby's head with eyes that were not quite dry and said, very quietly, "Are you all right?" "Very much so," she said. "He is remarkable," Clayton said. "He is very loud," she said fondly. "That is your doing," Clayton said, and she laughed, which woke James Robert, who expressed a strong opinion about being woken, which was very loud indeed. The years along the Picos had a shape to them that Margaret had not anticipated when she was a woman in a St. Louis tenement with nothing ahead but the long possibility of the West. They had the shape of work and season, of cattle and harvest, of the river rising and falling, of the cottonwoods going green and yellow and bare and green again. They had the shape of a marriage that deepened as good marriages do, not by becoming more dramatic but by becoming more known, more settled into itself, more itself than it had started as. Clayton expanded the cattle operation in 1876, buying 20 additional head from a rancher near Mora who was moving to Colorado, and the Winslow spread along the Picos became, by the standards of the valley, a sound and serious operation. He did this with the same methodical care he brought to everything, which meant it took longer than it might have taken someone more aggressive, and was significantly more durable as a result. Gregorio Sandoval watched the operation grow with the approval of a man who knows good husbandry when he sees it, and said once, in 1877, that the Winslow cattle were the best kept in the Picos Valley, which he stated as simple fact and not as flattery, which was how he stated most things, and Clayton received it that way. Pedro Vasquez stayed on and by 1877 was effectively the second in command of the cattle operation, still removing his hat in Margaret's presence and still capable of managing horses in a way that was close to conversation. He also began, in 1877, a careful and extended courtship of Gregorio Sandoval's niece, a young woman named Marisol who visited from Albuquerque that summer and stayed through the fall, and Margaret watched the whole development with the warm amusement of someone who recognized the signs and remembered what they felt like. She helped where she could, which was mostly in the form of providing occasions for Pedro and Marisol to be in the same location, and by Christmas of 1877, Marisol had moved to the valley and she and Pedro were married in the Anton Chico church in a ceremony that lasted most of a Saturday and involved more food than Margaret had seen at any single event in her life. Clayton stood at the back of the church with James Robert on his shoulders and the expression of a man deeply content with where he is, and Margaret stood beside him and took his hand, and he squeezed it without looking down because he did not need to look to know whose hand it was. In 1878, Margaret taught school. It had started because the small school in Anton Chico lost its teacher when he left for Albuquerque, and because Margaret was known in the valley as an educated woman, and because the families with children were frank about their need, and because she was her father's daughter and had never really stopped being a school teacher, even when she was not formally one. Clayton had said, when she raised it, "What do you want to do?" and she had said she wanted to teach, and he had said then do it, with the complete absence of complication that was characteristic of him on questions of her capability and her choices. She rode to Anton Chico 3 days a week on a bay mare named Clara, whom she had developed an affection for that Clayton said was entirely mutual from the horse's side. She taught reading, arithmetic, and geography, and also history, because she believed that children who did not know where they were in history were children who could not understand why the world was shaped the way it was. She taught the children of Mexican families who had been in the valley for generations and the children of Anglo settlers who had come west in the years since the war, and she taught them together, which caused some comment from some of the Anglo parents, and which she addressed with the directness her mother had taught her, which was that in her classroom every child had the same claim to learning, and that was not negotiable. James Robert started at the school in 1880 when he was 5, and was deeply offended to discover that his mother was the teacher, and that this did not entitle him to any special treatment. It was a lesson he absorbed slowly and then completely, in the manner of a child who is stubborn but not stupid, and by the end of his first year he was reading with the facility of someone a year ahead and driving the other children to distraction with his opinions about everything, which were numerous and offered at full volume. "He is yours," said Clayton one evening, watching James Robert explain something at considerable length to Pedro's oldest cat. "He is yours," said Margaret. "Look at the way he circles a thing before he says it." Clayton considered this. "He does not circle," he said. "He charges directly." "He charges directly," Margaret agreed, "but look at the length of the charge. He has been considering that cat for 10 minutes. Clayton watched their son, looked at Margaret. "Fair enough," he said. In 1881 their second child arrived, a girl this time, who came into the world with considerably less fanfare than James Robert had, efficiently and without fuss, which was perhaps the first indication of her eventual personality. They named her Clara Ruth Winslow, for the mare and for the cousin, and Ruth Dalton, when she heard this, wrote a letter that was almost entirely composed of her feelings about the honor of having a child named for her, which feelings were extensive and genuine, and moved Margaret thoroughly. Clara Ruth Winslow grew up to be precisely the kind of child her arrival had suggested, practical and observant and possessed of a calm that stood in complete contrast to her brother's permanent enthusiasm. She followed Clayton around the ranch from the time she could walk, absorbing everything about cattle and horses with an attention that was serious and focused, and by the time she was 4 she could identify every cow in the herd by name, which Clayton verified once by quizzing her systematically, and which she answered without error, and without apparent interest in the achievement because, for her, it was simply knowing what there was to know. The Pecos Valley in the early 1880s was not without its difficulties. There were land disputes between Anglo settlers and the families of the old Spanish land grants that had been in the valley for generations, disputes that were frequently unjust in ways that Margaret found difficult to watch, and that she refused to pretend did not exist. She and Clayton talked about these things with the honesty they brought to difficult things, and when there were things that could be done without overstepping, they did them. Clayton hired from the local Mexican families as a matter of course and paid fairly, and Margaret taught every child who came to the schoolroom with the same rigor and expectation, and these were not large gestures, but they were consistent ones, and consistency was the kind of thing that accumulated meaning in a small community over time. Gregorio Sandoval told Clayton once, in the way of a man who does not offer praise lightly, that the Winslows were good neighbors, and Clayton had said that they were trying to be, and Gregorio had said that trying and being were, in his experience, not so different when the trying was honest. In the spring of 1883, 9 years after a spring morning in Dodge City, when a woman with a carpetbag and $11.40 had looked across a street at a stranger and made the most consequential decision of her life, Clayton Winslow finished building the porch he had been planning since the first year. The wide covered porch on the south side of the adobe house that caught the afternoon light and looked out over the Pecos Valley and the Red Ridge to the north, and the mountains to the west that went purple at sunset and pink at dawn. He finished it on a Friday in April and said nothing about it to Margaret until after supper, when he said simply, "Come outside." She came outside and found the porch complete with 2 wooden chairs that he had made himself, positioned to face the valley and the mountains, and the evening light was doing what it did in April in New Mexico, which was to make everything look briefly like a painting of itself, warm and particular and available only for this specific hour. She stood looking at it for a long moment. "You built the chairs," she said. "I did," he said. "When did you build the chairs?" "Over winter," he said. "In the barn." "You did not notice because you were too busy arguing with James Robert about long division." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that steady expression, the one she had first seen on a street corner in Dodge City, Kansas, when he had decided in the space of a moment to put his arm around a stranger and say yes to whatever she needed, and which she had since come to understand as the face he wore when he was completely at ease and completely himself, which was the face she loved best of all. "Clayton Winslow," she said. "Margaret Winslow," he said. "You told me in Dodge City that you were looking for a place that felt like yours," she said. "I did," he said. "And," she said. He looked out at the valley, at the Pecos moving silver between its cottonwoods, at the Red Ridge and the far mountains, and the enormous New Mexico sky going orange and violet above all of it. He looked at the house behind them, adobe and solid, 9 years of labor and season in its walls. He looked at her. "Found it," he said. She took his hand. They sat down in the chairs he had made over winter in the barn, while she argued with their son about long division, and the evening settled around them with the patience of a thing that has been waiting exactly as long as it needed to. Inside, James Robert was explaining something at length and volume to his sister, who was responding in monosyllables that suggested she was not finding the explanation necessary. From the north pasture came the low voice of cattle, easy in the evening air. Somewhere along the river a bird made a sound like a question and then was quiet. The mountains went purple. The sky went deep. The first star appeared above the ridge to the east, bright and definite, and Margaret leaned her head against Clayton's shoulder and felt him put his arm around her, the way he had on a street corner in Dodge City in the spring of 1874. The same warmth, the same certainty, the same sense of being, in the most real and complete sense of the word, found. She thought about the woman she had been on that stagecoach, 11 days out of St. Louis, with nothing ahead but an uncertain Western address, and the specific desperation of a person who has run out of every option except one. She thought about what she had done with that desperation, which was to look across a street at a stranger with the borrowed authority of a woman with nothing to lose, and to call to him as though she had every right to, as though she had been looking everywhere for him and had finally found him. The funny thing, she thought, was that that had turned out to be true. "Clayton," she said. He said, the particular sound of a man completely at rest. "Thank you," she said, "for the street corner." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel the slow rhythm of his breathing. "I did not do very much," he said. "You walked across and grabbed my arm." "You said yes," she said. "Margaret," he said, and his voice had that quality it sometimes had in the evenings, when the day was done and they were here in this place that was theirs, warm and without guard. "Saying yes to you is the only intelligent thing I have ever reliably done." She laughed. The same laugh that had come out of her that first night by the trail fire, genuine and warm. Somewhere inside the house James Robert and Clara Ruth had reached some sort of resolution, and the volume had decreased to a murmur. The star above the ridge had been joined by several others. The Pecos moved south through the dark in its ordinary steady way, passing the place where they had stood and looked at it 9 years ago and known without being told that this was the place. The chairs were solid under them. The house was solid behind them. The land spread away in every direction, theirs by labor and by choice, and by the accumulated weight of 9 years of a life built deliberately, with full intention, on a foundation that had started as a fiction on a street corner, and had become, in the way that real things become themselves through honest use, as solid and true as the adobe walls around them. The night came fully in, and the stars came out in the particular abundance of the high desert, and they sat together in the chairs he had made over winter and watched the valley they had chosen settle into darkness, and there was nothing left open between them, nothing unresolved, nothing that needed to be said that had not been said or shown or built with their own hands, and the silence between them was the best kind of silence, the kind that is not empty but full of everything they had made together and everything still ahead, and it held them both, completely and without condition, the way that only the best things do.